Hello and welcome to episode 36 of the podcast of History with James. And basically today we're talking about the Khmer Rouge, and we call this one Hell on Earth, okay? And so before we get into the official podcast, let's talk about the business side of the podcast. We have over 100 subscribers now. We've added it to new and more hosting sites. We've added a YouTube channel, which might have different content from the podcast, or might have sporadic episodes of the podcast also available online on with the YouTube channel. The YouTube channel is monetized, so this is something I'm experimenting with to try to bring some revenue to try to cover some of the cost of the podcast. So anyway, we get to the first section, Southeast Asia, a world of turmoil. With the removal of the French from power in the 1950s, the entire mainland region of Southeast Asia, was in turmoil. Let me explain to you this here. Before Vietnam, the French had tried to come back, backed by American efforts to retake their colonial possessions of Indochina. This was because the Americans thought that by helping the French back into this Indochina region, that it would help, perhaps revive some of the French, and these, because they needed strong countries to help resist, the new formed Eastern Bloc countries, Hungary, I'm thinking it's Bulgaria, Poland, and these nations that were now communified. I'm just using that. I made that word up, but sort of their governments had been disassembled and put with allies of the Stalinist government. So anyway, there's that, and once the French are removed, there's sort of this weird power vacuum that takes place within this region. Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam were all engaged in violent conflicts. In North Vietnam, and with the Viet Cong guerrillas in the south, the North aimed at taking control of all Vietnam. We are all familiar with this sort of concept or this historical event. In Laos and Cambodia, this is the thing we're not so much familiar with as American history. You can get really deep into it. I've read quite a lot about Laos and now Cambodia. Of one of my focus areas of history is Southeast Asia. I did take history of Southeast Asia. I also have a background in Philippine history and culture, which is a class that I took as well. So I have looked at these types of things before. So in Laos and Cambodia, communist guerrillas aimed to take control of both countries. The Pathet Lao in Laos and the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia represented real threats to their respective governments. Okay. So this insurgency type battle. Well, people will draw the parallel between North Vietnam and the South. There is a Viet Cong guerrilla in the South, right? They're in the South that are trying to, overthrow the South government. But there is a difference in that there is an actual centralized government behind these Viet Cong guerrillas, with weapons, training, and also a regular army that's also helping fight the war. So that's what you get with there. So that's the difference. The difference in the Pathet Lao and the Khmer Rouge is they have a centralized government. Both these countries have centralized governments that are fighting against home governments that are fighting against these insurgencies. In Thailand, the government allowed American bases and territories to fight the war in Vietnam. The Thai government felt threatened by communists around them. So, Cambodia borders, I think both Cambodia and Laos. I'll have to pull up a map real quick. Let me just double check this. Just put Southeast Asia map or something, which it might just give me like a map of the Philippines and Indonesia, but we'll see. Southeast Asia. Okay. All right, let's take a look at this map here. Hopefully it gets bigger. I want to see if it gets bigger. Okay. I didn't want to get that close. I'm sorry. I'm using like this Google Maps thing. Yeah, so both Cambodia and Laos border Thailand. So, they were threatened. And they also had this guerrilla movement, though short-lived, within Thailand here. So you can tell, both Cambodia and Laos going communist, and the region going communist would have definitely affected, um, would have threatened or felt made the government of Thailand feel threatened. And okay, so they allow American bases to fight Vietnam War because it benefits them, right? To destroy the communists, or at least hold them at bay, protects their own country as well. In 1973, the U.S. government withdrew from the region, but the conflict did not stop here. It would be common in the region all the way up until the 1990s. If you wanted a quick walk through that, I'll try not to talk about our current subject, but let me just talk about some of the things that did happen. Okay, for example, the Vietnam War was fought between the South and the North. The North took over the South. From the South, we'll not mention the portion we're carrying on. China actually invades North Vietnam. And this is in the 80s or late 70s. I'm not exactly sure. I'd have to remember. In retaliation for moves that they took against Cambodia, these types of things. And yeah, and that's the 80s, and then we get all the way up into our story now, which covers all the way up into the 90s. Okay. The journey of this podcast, however, deals with the Cambodian struggle with the Khmer Rouge. By its end, 1 million Cambodians would be dead. There's some estimates that's higher than 2 million. I went with the low end of those numbers. Now, interesting, when historians try to give like a mid-ground or I don't know, it's different from people, but I tend to try to be conservative in my numbers, just because I want to try to, when you're talking about like what we call like general facts, you want to be able to be like, okay, that's a general fact, right? You don't want to have to spend too much time trying to argue your point. So I usually will take the midpoint. Sometimes I'll take the low number. This one I took the low number because I felt there was a little bit of exaggeration. I'm not demeaning this conflict in any way. I'm just simply saying it seemed kind of odd. I was trying to figure out where these sources came from, where they were getting these bigger numbers. Okay. While studying in Paris, a Khmer Rouge Cambodian man named Pol Pot came into contact with Marxist and Maoist philosophy. Now, this isn't to say that he believed all these things, but he was introduced to them. Okay, a lot of when the French ruled, a lot of intellectuals or people of Southeast Asia actually went to France, and this would include people like Ho Chi Minh, who actually studied in France. In the northeast jungle of Cambodia, Pol Pot and his guerrillas began their journey to take control in the 1960s. They had little power outside the zone their zone and operated on the edge of government territory. They were not a serious threat, so they weren't able to penetrate into this society. Okay, they were much more limited in their range. They were able to live in these hinterlands and faraway regions, but they were never able to really take much government property. In the 1970s, this would all change. There's 1970, this section called 1970, the power struggle. In 1970, the military of Cambodia overthrew the monarch. The prince, who was deposed by the military, threw his weight with the communists. This only worked to legitimize the movement. The Khmer Rouge allied with the monarch in theory. It's a little more complicated to explain this, but essentially they actually kept the monarch under house arrest for most of the period. But it just lets there's sort of this public image that they're, allied with the monarch. The Khmer Rouge allied with the monarch promised a peaceful existence and worked to gain the support of Cambodia's hinterlands outside the cities. Okay, so so they were able to gain the support of the people on the outside of the cities, because of this move here. The monarch here, partnered with the monarch in theory, right? It helps to elevate the status of more mainstream Cambodians. Lon Nol, the general in charge of the military government, had shown a leaning towards violence. In response to the coup in 1970, people demonstrated all over the country. Okay, let me explain to you what Khmer means. Khmer is the people of Cambodia, or the ethnic natives, there were a lot of Vietnamese in Cambodia, and there were also a lot of Chinese, ethnic Chinese. Khmer is the language of Cambodia, um, and Khmer is also the people, the ethnic people of Cambodia. Okay, but like I explained, there's a lot of ethnic Chinese, and there's actually a lot of Chinese throughout Southeast Asia in different pockets. Singapore, for example, in Malaysia, in Vietnam, certainly before the Vietnam War, a lot of the boat people, so to speak, the people that who got on these these boats, kind of, not safe boats to try to get away, were ethnic Chinese because they own businesses and these types of things. Okay. So Lono, in 1970, people demonstrated all over the country. When Khmer people marched on the capital, Lono ordered his troops to fire on the protesters. This only helped in the communist case. The communists promised something most people were longing for: peace, right? So, city by city is a section called. Before 1973, the country was so disrupted by the American B-52 bombings that the Khmer Rouge were delayed in their takeover. So essentially, what happens is the North Vietnamese use what's called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and the Ho Chi Minh Trail actually goes through these international territories that Americans and Vietnamese troops are not supposed to be in. That goes through Laos and then into sorry, let me look at the map one more time. Sorry, I always get that area mixed up a little bit. Okay, yeah, I was right. So part of the trail went in through Laos and then into Cambodia and then worked its way all the way into the south. Okay, and this is because American troops did not go into Cambodia and Laos for the most part. In Laos, there was a Hmong indigenous people that the CIA armed and supplied, and they were supposed to fight the Pathet Lao. In Cambodia, it was much more. Yeah, towards the end of the war, the American troops did push into Cambodia, but they were forced to withdraw because the support for the war was so bad. But okay, so what was I saying? And then but the Americans bombed these trails that were inside the countries, and they were trying to wipe out these trails or prevent supplies from getting into the Vietnam side of the things. Okay, so that's what we're referring to when we talk about B-52 bombings. And they bombed both Cambodia and Laos. Where are we at here? City by city. Oh, yeah. So the Khmer Rouge were delayed. The country was so disrupted by B-52 bombings that the Khmer Rouge were delayed in their takeover. But when the bombings stopped in August of 1973, the communist rebels began their attack. Joel Brinkley, a professor of journalism at Stanford, described the progress of Pol Pot and his rebels in 1973 by writing, "By mid-1973, the Khmer Rouge now controlled much of the Cambodian countryside. From this base, their power only increased. On April 17, 1975, the Khmer Rouge marched into the Cambodian capital. However, this was only the beginning of Cambodia's troubles." So, you think, perhaps some of the more violent things that Lon Nol and these type of military leaders are perpetrating against the people are going to now stop. The Khmer Rouge had promised peace, right, and these types of things. But what happens is we revert back to, say, the French Revolution, and we use this term reign of terror. Cambodians were in for a surprise, as the Khmer Rouge were not committed to peace, but a radical overhaul of society. As Mary Summers Hyde Hughes, a historian of Southeast Asia, would write, in democratic Kampuchea, this is what they renamed the country, as they renamed Cambodia. The royal court was in democratic Kampuchea, as they renamed Cambodia, the royal court was abolished, schools and monasteries emptied, and cities evacuated. Their populations herded into the countryside to work in huge agricultural cooperatives. Families were driven apart, and intellectuals murdered in mass. Okay, so that pretty much speaks for itself, the type of overhaul of society that was going on. And Pol Pot wanted to start Cambodia at the year zero, a remaking of society from scratch. Like a wrecking ball, all would be torn down and remade in this new image. Okay, Cambodia will be remade into an agrarian society that's farming-based, pure and untainted by capitalism and also the excesses of modern day things. In the capital alone, 2.5 people were evacuated to the countryside to work in camps, the purest form of labor. So, in their ideology, the only really good work, or the purest form of work, is farming. Okay, because it's not tainted by city life and the excesses that are created by city life. Other camps were set up as well, where intellectuals, Buddhists, foreigners, and businessmen, corrupting forces, were tortured and murdered. So anything that was seen as Western or not communist in per se would be taken out. The most infamous of these was S-21, where many victims were murdered. A movie in Khmer, Khmer is the language of Cambodia, with the same title, S-21, details the harrowing accounts of the survivors. And it's available on Netflix if you'd like to look at it. I did try to watch it. It's very hard to watch. Part of it was the content. The other part was it was in Khmer, and I was having a hard time keeping up with the subtitles. In another camp, 15,000 people were murdered, with only 20 people ever leaving the camp. So that just lets you know how en masse these killings were. The Khmer Rouge wanted to eliminate all aspects of society before them. This included all the people of the mentioned groups before. Okay. So this is, people that symbolized a different kind of living. For example, if they caught you wearing glasses, you were in a lot of trouble. Writing was as a sign of, something they didn't like, or these types of things, which you would find weird because in other forms of communism, especially in the Soviet Union and what is Russia, a lot of the people that became the communist revolutionaries and the leadership were intellectuals. And what does this exactly mean? These are people that are learned scholars and these types of things. And why is that? Well, in the case of Russia, most of the population was easily able to be, let's see, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this. A lot of the people in the country and in Russia itself didn't know how to read and write. So they were easily able to be manipulated. So if you were intellectual, you had a certain advantage. And this is detailed in a book called Animal Farm. I think it's Orwell, George Orwell. I could be wrong. You'll notice that I think the horses and the pigs can write, and no one else can read and write. So this gives them a certain amount of power with the people, just so you know. But in this case, it is wanting people to go back to the most simplest and most basic parts of life. In agrarian society, people tend to think it's more of an even playing field because work is such a basic skill that it's attainable by all people. But then again, this is just like really corrupted thinking, I think, for the most part. Because you can't go back from having a city to farming communities overnight, and also it's just kind of a radical move, to say the least. On a visit to China, Khmer communists remarked their society would be, quote, be the first nation to create a completely communist society without wasting time on intermediate steps. What do they mean by this? In theory, communism would be achieved through steps, but Pol Pot and his followers wanted to reach this overnight. The world in darkness is the next section. The world, meanwhile, had been cut off from Cambodia. They were unaware of the things that were being perpetrated inside Cambodia. And this just goes back to another book that I was reading. Who is it by? I'm trying to remember. Sorry, I got to try to find his name again. He was Joel Brinkley, a professor of journalism at Stanford. Oh, I think I might have skipped a section. So by 1973, bombing stopped in August 9th. Communist rebels began their attack. Joel Brinkley, professor of journalism at Stanford, described the progress of Pol Pot and his rebels by writing, by mid-1933, the Khmer Rouge now controlled much of Cambodia's countryside. That was in 73, so we're just going back. In 75, they take over, and now we're into the portion of the camps and these types of things here. We call this section the world in darkness. The world, meanwhile, had been cut off from Cambodia. They were unaware of the things perpetuated inside Cambodians. And this is going back to Joel Brinkley's book, where he talks about a lot of the State Department reaction in America from the things going on. And Joel Brinkley does talk a lot about how they weren't able to really, a lot of things were fuzzy. They weren't sure because, like I said, you know, they were the world had been cut off, literally cut off because the Khmer Rouge had basically turned inwards and cut off them from the rest of the world. Charles Twining, a State Department officer, confirmed this in explaining the lack of insight the State Department had. He would say of the situation, quote, with the fall of Cambodia, we all knew the accounts about the evacuations of Phnom Penh, that's the capital, and believed them. Continuing this thought, he went on, but did anyone have a good grasp of the situation in other cities at the time? Hardly. That's what he says. So they knew about the evacuation of, Phnom Penh, the capital, but they had really no knowledge of what was going on in the other cities in Cambodia. In the end, 1 million or as high as 2 million were killed. The 2 million is just giving you the range. Either worked to death and or tortured. Others also just faced execution as being part of the old system or bourgeoisie. So what put a stop to the violence? That will be answered in the next section. Foreigners are the devils, we entitled this section. No one could figure out why Cambodians were crossing into Vietnam. This is also continuing into Joel Brinkley's book and dealing with the things he was talking about. No one could figure out why Cambodians were crossing into Vietnam. After all, Cambodians hated the Vietnamese. The reality of the situation was showing just how bad things were. While Washington believed the Khmer Rouge were allied with the Vietnamese, State Department officer Kenneth Quinn would contradict this in his report to Washington, writing, the KK is just basically another way of saying Cambodian communist, are strongly anti-Vietnamese and desire to force all Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army units out of Cambodia. Like I said, Cambodia was used as a staging area on the, let's see, I'm trying to number my words here. On the Ho Chi Minh Trail, it was the supply line ran through both Laos and Cambodia. Again, KK, he is referencing as a short for Cambodian Communist. It was this very fact that brought an end to the killing, as Vietnam invaded in 1978. Khmer incidents at the border and killings of communists sympathetic to Vietnamese inside Cambodia welcomed the attacks. In December of 1978, Vietnamese troops crossed the border and overran the country. The Vietnamese deposed the Khmer Rouge, and in its place they placed a puppet. They placed a puppet government loyal to them. However, there was still more trouble after this. So, while the invasion stopped, the most pressing violence, stopped the most pressing violence. Foreign influence kept resistance going. What do I mean by foreign influence? Well, the foreign influence is basically the Khmer Rouge, and I have no idea who the Khmer Rouge are really allied with, and then the separate communist, backed by Vietnam. Okay, so Cambodia was now made up into three elements: the pro-royalists, the people who liked the old government, and the royalists. The Khmer Rouge, the radical communists, and then they had the Vietnamese-backed government, which was sort of a radical version of the Khmer Rouge. It's how bad the Khmer Rouge were. For the next 20 years, the country would know nothing but war. Elections held in 1998 on the aim of choosing one leader and perhaps an end to the conflict. But Hun Sen of the Vietnamese-backed government killed or suppressed his political rivals. Now, there was an article recently talking about, corruption charges in the highest court. And, there is still turmoil in Cambodia, but it is in a more civil way. Like I said, there was a recent article that I saw just like 2 days ago that I was looking at. And, they were talking about, let me see if I just type in Cambodia and see what comes up. But there are multiple parties inside Cambodia. Um, it's not an officially communist country, but it still has a communist party. Let's see if I can find it. I did see like a ABC article about Cambodia, but it's so much better than it was. There's still a lot of troubles. I would say it's better than Laos, uh, as far as its political system. So basically, they have like a constitutional council that reviews all complaints of the elections. They had an election in June. The let's see, I'm trying to remember who the parties are in Cambodia. Sorry, trying to figure this out real quick before we end this podcast. Um, hmm, okay, this article. Sorry, it's loading. This is, just to give you sort of a current events thing that's going on. This is, I believe, in New Zealand, because NZ stands for New Zealand, I think. Article. Cambodia's highest court. This is like today's date, actually. Cambodia's highest court, the Constitutional Council, on Tuesday began reviewing the contested results of last month's general election, leaving open a small possibility that will resolve the opposition's claims of unfairness. The review comes after the state National Election Committee on Saturday rejected all 19 complaints filed by political parties against the results of the July 28th polls. The official results would give the ruling Cambodia's People's Party 68 seats. That's the party backed by Vietnam. So it would give them 68 seats in the 123 National Assembly and 55 to the opposition Cambodia Rescue National Party. I'm assuming these are the royalists. I'd have to look this up real quick. So you see, there's at least a process in the government now. They don't go fighting like before. There we go. They don't go fighting like before. It's more a civil, discontent. Like going through the courts to try to make sure there's no corruption in these types of things. But said that the street protests would be last resort, but the threat raised fears of political violence. So let's see here. Cambodia. I'll just read you what Wikipedia says. I know that sounds kind of dumb. It might just be the Royalist Party or a coalition of opposition parties inside Cambodia. It is a Cambodia elected between the two major opposition parties, the Sam's Rainsy Party and Human Rights Party. Sam Rainsy was a personalist liberal party in Cambodia. The party was a party. It was a member of the Council of Asian Liberals and Democrats. Okay, so they're both kind of left of center. Liberal Democrat is the word I would use, I guess. I'm just trying to figure out who's in this, party. Oh yeah, so this is a new. It's pretty much a new party. It says ideology, liberalism, liberal democracy, liberal nationalism, human rights. So it's sort of a new party, combining other elements that are against the communists. So politically speaking, Laos is still a one-party state, and so is Vietnam. So Cambodia, relatively to the region, that's what you want to look at in a context, is more free in many ways, politically speaking. So that's what I have to say about that. They may not be doing as economically well as Laos and Laos's Vietnam, who have opened up to Western style economics, but politically speaking, I think it's a good first step to have two parties in countries that had a history of communist rule. But anyway, so if you'd like a copy of the show notes, you can email me at james80819. Please check out the YouTube channel, History with James. You should be able to. I think you could search it. Let me just pull this up and see if I can search it on YouTube real quick before we go. And there'll be exclusive content for the YouTube channel. I think I've just decided that it is being monetized, so I'm wondering if that's going to bring some revenue or not. Okay, it's a lot harder to find. Maybe I'll read the URL. Okay. I'm just trying to find it. If I can't find it, let me log in real quick and I'll see if I can give you the URL for History with James. Sorry, I know we're like done talking about our topic here for the most part. But I just want to make sure we can get the YouTube channel out there. It is History with James. I have, for some reason, it's weird. I have two accounts on my one email, which I was trying to figure that out. But let me see my channel. Okay, I will read this. YouTube.com. Is it /channel/? Wow, is it really that complicated? Let me try refreshing real quick. How do you... Yeah, let's do that. Okay, we'll try to read this as it appears. It's youtube.com/channel/VRV/EPZO4KAEYXJMYA. That's to get to the page. Okay. So again, youtube.com/channel/uppercase U, uppercase C, uppercase Y, lowercase J, uppercase U, uppercase L, lowercase B, lowercase R, lowercase V, and then capital V, lowercase E, P, Z uppercase, O4, K uppercase, lowercase A, E, Y, X, J, uppercase M, lowercase Y, uppercase A. And I'm not sure why it does that, honestly. But anyway, this is James and signing off and saying good luck.